My name is John T. Cusack. Well, I think we did get into the convention, and it was designed to limit the manufacture of narcotic drugs, that would be opium and its derivatives and cocaine, to levels commensurate with the world's medical needs. And it established a body called the Drug Advisory Body. And that body would set quotas for all countries within the United Nations, or even outside of the United Nations at that time. And the manufacturing countries would be obliged to only supply levels of legal pharmaceutical narcotic export to those countries. Now, the manufacturing countries, and this brings up something that is, I think, somewhat interesting, in that today we hear producer countries that are illegally producing narcotic drugs, and in general they are countries in development. They are countries where there is what we call primitive agriculture, and they complain that the industrial world is forcing them to give up these crops. Well, the industrial world gave up manufacture. We know that industry is created through manufacturing, and we go back now, it's almost 60 years, it's more than 60 years that the European countries, the United States and Canada, Japan in the Orient, all had huge pharmaceutical industries producing large quantities of these substances. And they, adhering and adopting the provisions of the 1931 convention, stepped right in immediately and reduced the production of these substances. So they made a big political and you might say financial sacrifice for the good of all mankind. And as I think I pointed out earlier, the 1931 convention had a dramatic impact on the supply of drugs throughout the world. I think it was estimated that when it came into effect, that morphine, which is the basic alkaloid of opium from which heroin would be made, was being produced 10 times in quantity than was needed for medical requirements. And so we see a dramatic downturn taking place right after 1931, even though the treaty was not in force. As soon as it was prepared, as soon as it was, the ink was dry on it, countries began taking steps to comply with the convention because they recognized what they had to do. And this provided a dramatic cutback throughout the world. And I was amazed in that when I first became an agent in 1947, when we would make an important case, old-timers, men who were working in the 30s and in the 20s, would say, this is nothing, this is a good case, but this is nothing compared to what we experienced. This is not big. So we used to get hogsheads full of morphine and heroin and cocaine. We used to get packing crates full of it. We used to get hundreds of kilos of these substances. And we, and I also, we thought that they were putting us on. We really didn't accept what they were saying totally. And but when you look up old files, and you got into old files because it took you back to cases that you were working, we saw this, and I saw this, and then it was really indelibly in my mind. And then when I traveled to Europe in 1950, worked in Europe for 2 years, and then subsequently to Australia, I was amazed that the old-timers told me the same thing. They were telling me, oh, in the 20s here in Australia, we had a great problem with morphine and heroin, and we don't see that, you know, and most of the police and even our own people didn't understand why that happened. It happened because manufacture was taken away. And we find that the only place where a clandestine manufacture, where an embryonic manufacture began to replace the legal production that was being diverted to the illicit traffic was in France. The 1931 convention came into force in 1934, and we saw the reduction then in both availability and seizures, purity. The quantities, for example, beginning in 1931, the cocaine traffic collapsed. We never seized more than 10 kilos of cocaine from 1931 until 1964, 65. Most of the seizures in the United States of cocaine, all during a 30-year period, a little more than 30 years, were 2 kilos, 3 kilos, 4 kilos a year. 5 kilos was a lot of cocaine. One year we seized 14 kilos. That was in 1949. Then it dropped down again to lower, to single digits again.
So did that convention of 1931, that was responsible, so we didn't have any more conventions then?
Well, what happened was, it was recognized by the experts, by governments, that the drugs had been brought under control. Mm-hmm. Now, we saw immediately the cranking up of the French Connection. We see, I'd say, the years 34 to about 36, that 2 or 3 year period, where it was probably the lowest level. But then by 36, 37, we start to see the French Connection coming on, and this was clandestinely manufactured heroin, made in Paris and Marseille by underworld operators. Formerly, these same operators were obtaining their supplies from legal factories through subterfuge and through possibly connivance and corruption and so forth.
Okay.
But there was somewhat of a celebration. My gosh, I think we've got it. You know, the experts were saying, we've got it. And they said, now what we got to do is we've got to be more effective against illicit traffic, you see, because now it's the illicit traffickers who are manufacturing the heroin. Now, they couldn't manufacture cocaine. You see, treaties do very interesting things. When you get ahead, when you do things in trying to suppress the availability of drugs, there are certain things you can do which will get so far ahead of them. You get the jump on them. I'm afraid that for the last 30 years they've had the jump on us. We got a tremendous jump on them. They could never, they did not develop the capability to clandestinely produce cocaine from the early 1930s, 31, up really until the mid 60s. And then they were able to do that in South America. They got themselves organized, and they began an escalation in the clandestine production of cocaine in South America, which was very similar to the French Connection development of heroin production in Western Europe or in France, to supply basically the markets in Canada and the United States. Now, and so, to go back to the treaties, the experts said, you know, we've got to do better in suppressing illicit traffic. That's all we have to do. To the great credit of the United States, our Treasury Department under Anslinger, the Narcotic Bureau, the Federal Narcotic Bureau, And the key men in the State Department who were involved in this work on a full-time basis over a number of years and were very knowledgeable, and they were as determined as was men like Anslinger in the Treasury Department to get at the control of opium and the coca leaf. Because the basic premise, the foundation premise of narcotic control is supply reduction, and you cannot be effective with supply reduction if you have no control over the cultivation of the opium poppy and the coca leaf in countries where they have been produced, or where they even are not produced, where they could be produced, if there's no prohibition against that. They take in international drug control what they can get, what they think everyone will agree to. And it was agreed that they would have a convention against the illicit traffic, suppression of the illicit traffic. And the United States hoped that they might be able to get some provision in that convention which would prohibit the production of opium. But they were unsuccessful in doing that. There were a few countries that supported the United States in that. And so they met in Geneva again in 1936, and they completed a convention which became known as the Geneva Convention for the Repression of the Illicit Traffic in Narcotic Drugs of 1936. And it was of limited effectiveness. Unfortunately, it fell afoul of the two different legal systems, the Napoleonic Code, the Code Civil of the European countries, and the Anglo-Saxon Code of the United States, Canada, Britain, and all the former British territories or existing British territories at that time. The convention was of limited effectiveness, and was within 3 years anyway. World War II came. However, from 1936 onward, we see the rise of the French Connection. We see heroin seizures. One year they seized 88 kilos. I think that was 1939. But the average seizures of heroin were in the 20 to 30 kilo range in the mid to late 30s. They had to find a way to manufacture, get their hands on heroin. And they figured out pretty quickly that they had the skills there. They could find the technical know-how from renegade chemists, and to manufacture heroin or cocaine from a base product like morphine base or opium. But let's talk about heroin. At first, we know that they tried smuggling opium in from Turkey. And let me say something then at that time. The fact that we did not have the opium fields in Yugoslavia, Greece, Bulgaria, and Turkey, right close to Europe. I mean, all of those countries, even Turkey is part of it, is in Europe. They're all European countries. And they were all connected by rail to Paris. They're all connected by Mediterranean shipping to the ports, the French ports, particularly Marseille. And at first they started to smuggle opium. But opium had the odor, and it was bulky. And you know, you need 10 kilos of opium for 1 kilo of morphine base, which would transform into 1 kilo of heroin, roughly. So they recognized after a while, they'll take opium if they can get it, but what they wanted was morphine base, which is again converted through a simple chemical process, a crude process, in a very primitive laboratory. And they started smuggling that. That was coming from Yugoslavia and Turkey, basically, and possibly some came from Bulgaria and Greece, from the Macedonia area of Greece, of Yugoslavia. A place called Skopje was the center. Skopje. It's now the new capital of the new Republic Macedonia, which is part of the old Yugoslavia. Orient Express. It so happened that from Venice to Istanbul, the conductors, the porters, the train crews were essentially Yugoslavians, and they are very adept at languages. They have so many in their own country, so many dialects, and we had, and then in the area of the opium production, there were smugglers and organized criminal groups who were making the morphine base and shipping it to France. And the French were also getting morphine base from Turkey, and they were also getting morphine base from Greece, from the opium production. It was a small opium production in Greece. Germany and Italy were at these times under a fascist socialistic mode, and they were in effect police states. France was a democracy. One has to understand that Paris was the center of France, and Paris was, other European countries might not agree, but the center of Europe. It was the continental cosmopolitan city, is the greatest city on the continent, and there was all kinds of skills and opportunities there, and organizations to get this thing done. And Paris was also just a short train ride or automobile ride down to the port of Le Havre, where they could load the heroin onto ships for the States. And it was also close to the great ports of, and they used them too, Antwerp and Rotterdam. But France, like any great city, you can't compare the underworld of San Diego with that of New York. Paris is a city that had an infrastructure to carry this out. Many of these people came from Marseille. It was the Corsican underworld. Now, what is also fascinating is that there were a silk glove type of fancy con men, criminals, who were involved with the traffic from the 20s into the early 30s. And many of these people continued on for a few years, but they seem to have disappeared, and the Corsicans took it over completely by the mid-30s and the late 30s. But what is fascinating is that these people were, the names that we know and the big cases we made in the late 30s were still around in 1946 and started right up again. But they were having difficulty in getting morphine base and getting supplies. And many of them, some died in the war, and they had lots of infighting. Some were collaborationists with the Germans, and some were in resistance. And of course they brought in younger people. We began to learn more about them after the war than before the war. They were new people, and their links with the Italian mafia were very clear to us, were in our file. We were making cases in New York in the late 30s, 37, 38, against groups of French and mafia Italians working together, French heroin being carried out by the mafia. Pre-war clandestine manufacture of heroin in France came about through the ability of the French underworld to obtain morphine base from Yugoslavia and Turkey and transport it by rail and by a ship into Marseille or by rail into Paris. And that was a heavy route. They probably shipped as much by rail as they did by ship. And these were probably in 5 and 10 kilo shipments. And even then, the link up with the organizations that they were supplying in New York, all of this went to New York. And we did not find many French in New York at that time. Their connections were through mafia types frequently into New York mafia types. And cases were made, prosecutions went forward, and some heavy sentences were handed down. I participated in the arrest of a Sicilian in 1952 in Alcamo, Sicily, a major mafia man, Serafino Mancuso, who had been arrested in the United States in a narcotic case and had done 10 years in Leavenworth prison. Was released sometime in the late 40s. To some extent, the way they developed these cases, seizures were made in France by the French police and customs, and we had representatives. The Federal Narcotic Bureau had representatives in France and in Europe, Italy and France, going back to the early 30s and through 1939. And leads came from France, and leads were forwarded from New York to Europe and to France to investigate these cases, these seizures. But I would say that it was incredible during the war, and when I look back on it now, I never cease to be amazed, and I'm bragging now, how good we were. Perhaps it wasn't that there were so many, there were so few, but we could ferret them out. We were very successful in identifying these people. They were always in our files, and I could give you an example. One time I received a letter from a man in Le Havre, and he was a former seaman on the French line, and he had been arrested, and he did several years in jail on a big case. I don't know if it was 40, maybe as much as 40 kilos of a shipment, but I think they were parceling it over to New York. And he told me in 1952 that the people behind that ship, and it was known as the Champlain, that was the name of the French line vessel, and he told me that there were 3 men who were partners. One he called Jean le Chevreau Blanc. That means John with the silver hair, the gray hair, the white hair. And the other was Charles Vincileone. And the fourth he described as Auguste Calme. It turned out that Auguste Calme, true name was Jean Jehan. And Jean Jehan was the man in the French Connection case in New York, the case, you know, that they call the French Connection case. There was maybe 100 cases, and of the 100 cases, probably 50 of them were more important than that case, but that was a very good case. I'm not taking anything away from that case. He was the one known in the case as Frog 1, I believe, and the one that won the subway. He was the leader of the operation at New York, and he escaped. But we later caught him in 1972. But those 3 men now they had been operating. Now, when this man was telling me about Jean Le Cheval Blanc, that was I had the name on my tip of my tongue, Jean Laget. That was Jean Laget, and we were in the process at New York in developing a case against Jean Laget. And Jean Laget was arrested and prosecuted and went to jail for many years. So we had gotten Jean Laget. Then we'd gotten Jean Jehan, who eluded us for many years, but we put him out of business, in effect, and caught him later on, around 1972, 73.
And he is the one, for people who are only familiar with the case.
French Connection
they're
case.
familiar with
he
the
was
movie.
Frog One, yeah.
And he's the one who escapes at the end of the movie.
That's right.
But you're identifying him as Jean
Jehan.
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 And you caught him in?
He was caught at the age of,
Right.
I think, 80 in a laboratory in the Marseille area around 1974. To give you an idea, at some point in early 1949, Garland H. Williams, Colonel Garland H. Williams, who was still the district supervisor of the New York region, he was an innovator and a manager par excellence, a leader who could stimulate, and he liked surprises. And at his Monday morning meeting, early, it was either late 48 or early 49, he said that he wanted to again concentrate. The trends were evident, and he wanted to concentrate on three ethnic groups. I didn't put it in those terms. These were three national types, if you will. It would be the Italian mafia organized crime groups, smuggling, heroin, or whatever, French traffickers, and Hispanic traffickers would be Cuban and Puerto Rican in New York area. And so he assigned senior agents to start research on that and set up to collect and sort out the existing trends and information, and as they needed support manpower, he would give it to them. And they were given a private office and their own files and given clerical support. Well, I used to talk to these men, and the Puerto Ricans, was J. Ray Oliveira, a great investigator, and he was going along very nicely, and the ones with the Italian Joe Amato was assigned to handle that element, and a man by the name of Arthur Giuliani was assigned to the French Connection. We didn't call it a French Connection, we called it the French Traffickers. And he was having the toughest time because they were very few, but he was dogged, and he expanded his horizons at all time. And it wasn't until Oliveira, he was off and running, and he was making conspiracy cases within 1949, within a year. And Amato was getting things going, but Giuliani stuck with it, but he wasn't scoring, as we would say. I have to say that I thought I was skeptical. I didn't hear of any Frenchmen. I was working. I was making cases. I was involved with Jewish violators and organized crime types and Italian violators and Frenchmen. I never heard of any Frenchmen. I thought this was really. I had great confidence in Garland Williams and certainly in Giuliani, but I didn't see anything, and I was skeptical. I said, well, maybe it isn't there. Giuliani's not finding it, but sooner or later, it wasn't until 1951. It was almost 2 years before he got into the Orsini case, and we were beginning to know then, because that it was linked up. The French was Paris, Marseille, Montreal, New York. And Orsini, we had things in the file on Orsini. And we knew that, believe it or not, some of the French connection traffickers had fled to Canada and the United States after the war to avoid prosecution for their involvement as collaborators with the Nazis. And you had, and let me say this, the earliest French connection types that were identified, and there was a movie made of these people. The movie was called Borsellino, with Alain Delon and another famous French actor. The movie's probably 10 years old, maybe it's older than that. But it's about Marseille and gangsters in Marseille. And the two men that the movie really were the types in the movie that the characters were patterned on was a man named Carbone and Francois Spirito. And Francois Spirito was in New York at this time, coming in and out of New York. And Carbone and Spirito were men who we know were the first to set up the first big operation of clandestine manufacture and international distribution. Along with the other three, they were separate apparently, but they all knew each other, which was Laget and Jehan and Vincileone. Giuliani made that case, which was linked with both the Genovese and the Lucchese crime families in New York. And that case also involved Joseph Valacchi, who became, a few years later, it's more than a few years, almost 13 years later, he became the source of fully and completely identifying the 5 families of the mafia before the Senate and before for the law enforcement agencies. From that point on, the New York office constantly was developing leads and providing information to our European offices, but particularly in France and Italy, on the activities, the movement of the French connection, and providing witnesses, providing informants. And we, on the other side, both out of our Beirut office, out of our Marseille, Paris, and Rome offices, were providing leads to New York. And if you go through the years, we were batting 350, believe me, and there's no question in my mind. I could make the case. It would take hours to document all the cases, and you see the levels of the traffic. The traffic was kept in bounds. It was kept in bounds during those years, and it didn't. The supply grew slowly, and the capability to manufacture. See, one of the things we knew from the French connection was they were having difficulty in obtaining all the morphine base that they wanted. They had more capacity to produce more heroin, but they couldn't get the morphine base because they were competing with each other for morphine base. But the morphine base just was not there. They just couldn't get it. And I remember talking to a man who was a go-between. He was an Italian. He was a go-between between the French connection heroin manufacturers and traffickers and the mafia. And he got to know the French. He was a French speaker. He got to know the French very well. And I asked him one time, why, how much did he think they were producing in volume of heroin in Marseille? And this was probably around 1959. And he thought I was insulting his intelligence. He said, you're an intelligent man, and I know you by reputation. Why do you ask me a question like that? I says, well, I don't understand. What's wrong with the question? Did they make 100 kilos a month? Did they make 200? Did they make 300? He looked at me, he says, they make as much as they can have morphine base. If they have 10 kilos of morphine base, they make 10 kilos of heroin. If they have 1,000 kilos of morphine base in a month, they'll make 1,000 kilos of heroin. It is the morphine base. That's the only thing. So that turned me and my focus toward Turkey and the morphine base, and Lebanon and the morphine base. Morphine base, coming to the French Connection, came in the early years, post-war years, through 1968, the 1968 Israeli-Arab War. Following that, in other words, why was Lebanon so important? Well, the French felt comfortable in Lebanon. Mm-hmm. They had a mandate there for after World War I, and they had connections there. And the Lebanese spoke French very well, and the Lebanese traffickers, and it was a pleasant place. And so the morphine base, most of the morphine base at that point in time was being manufactured, a lot of it in southern Turkey, and also in Syria, and then moved into Lebanon for smuggling to Paris or Marseille, mostly to well, frequently I think it went by air to Paris, it went by ship to Marseille, into the laboratories. Also, there were groups in Istanbul and in southern Turkey, in the towns on the border with Syria, where they were making the morphine base. And then by 1968 we saw a shift that things got rather chaotic in Lebanon, and the Turks were getting more and more organized, and there had been a Turkish migration into Western Europe beginning in the early 60s, which had reached a very high level, and Turkey was using bases in Italy, in Germany, to move morphine base in, and then they were moving in truckloads, and they had another traffic moving out back to Turkey with smuggled goods, all kinds of consumer goods, whether it was nylon stockings for women or cosmetics, various watches, all kinds of semi-valuable items. And the French Connection grew in volume. Now, I can tell you that the cases we were making right after the war, from the 1946-47 through about 1950, they were smuggling about 5 to 10 kilos per shipment. This could be a body carry, or given to a seaman, or cached in an automobile. Then in 1955, we learned that they were smuggling. We had developed evidence of this in cases and prosecutions, 25 kilos per shipment. Then in 1960, we seized our first 100 kilogram shipment. Before that, let me say, we seized our first 50 kilogram shipment, and then in 1964 we got a seizure of 60 kilos, and then I think in 1965 or 66 we got a shipment of 95 kilos, and then 1968 I think we got our first seizure of over 100 kilos, or a little over 100 kilos, and then from that time on the shipments were in the neighborhood of 100 kilos, but the largest shipment was in 1972, when a shrimp boat at Marseille was seized with 432 kilos. And we know that 2 previous trips had been made by that vessel, and it probably was going to Florida. I never tire of congratulating and and stating my great admiration for Anslinger and the people in the State Department who provided for the transfer of the responsibility for international narcotic control from the League of Nations to the United Nations in 1945, and starting with the Commission on Narcotic Drugs in 1946. And the first thing they had to do was to prepare a protocol in 1946. This was administrative things. And this protocol transferred the conventions and the responsibility for their administration from the League of Nations to the United Nations. And then another technical thing had to be done as quickly as possible, and that was the synthetic narcotic drugs such as pethidine or Demerol, as it is commonly known, and methadone. They had to be brought under the regime of the conventions. So in 1948, they had another protocol was prepared in Paris, international protocol under the UN auspices, to bring those under the conventions. They would be treated similar as opium would be, and opium derivatives. Then the United States made the move to do what it had been trying to do for at least 10, 15 years, bring the crops under control. Now, having had a great deal of experience with trying to reach too far, and the fact that cocaine was not a problem at the time. We were still seizing 2 kilos, 3 kilos a year, and we're seizing now, 30, 40 kilos of heroin a year at that point in time. A decision was made that they would prepare a convention that would bring the production of opium under control as narcotic drugs were under control internationally. And in 1953 at the UN in New York, they prepared what they call the Opium Protocol of 1953. And in effect, it limited the number of countries that could legally produce opium for medical purposes. That is a cardinal principle of narcotic control. And those countries were Yugoslavia, Greece, Bulgaria, Turkey, Iran, Soviet Union, and India. And they were required, if they grew opium, to license each and every farmer to establish how much in hectarage or acreage he could grow, and he would be required to deliver his entire crop to a government monopoly. That was the start. Now, that treaty didn't come into effect, or that protocol did not take effect until 1962. Unfortunately, the reason it didn't was that the Soviet bloc took a position, a political position, that the UN or any international organization had no right to tell any government by a convention that it could not produce opium. Well, it didn't exactly do that. It permitted any country to grow opium for its own needs, which would be small. That was a sovereign right. But it did have the right, and I think the World Court agreed with that it did have the right to limit the number of countries that could produce opium for export, for international legal drug production. So that was unfortunate because all things were delayed. Turkey argued with that convention. Turkey did not ratify that convention until 1962 or 1963, when it took effect, because if they didn't ratify that convention at that time, no country could that ratified it could buy opium from Turkey. Mm-hmm. So while they were opposing it as an affront to their sovereignty and saying that opium producers were being picked on and so forth, they finally ratified it when it was greatly in their economic interest to do so. However, in the late 50s, let me put it this way, the UN Commission kept diplomatically pressing Turkey to ratify the protocol. And they said that they would not ratify it, but they would adopt its provisions. And in 1959, they adopted a law which they said they'd put into effect in 1960, which would license the farmers and collect the opium and limit the number of licenses. Well, they did some of that, but they did not implement we came to learn subsequently that they did not effectively implement the program. And so opium production, opium became increasingly available. And this was a period of development in Turkey where they were building roads, and instead of the opium coming out on the backs of donkeys, the opium was coming out on the backs of 2.5-ton trucks going over good blacktop roads. So this was a causative effect fact in bringing about availability. And with the Turkish infrastructure in Europe, moving it more effectively into Europe they could smuggle better. You had Turks going up in cars and trucks and all kinds of things. So that was the situation. In the fall of 1965, President Johnson had the occasion to meet with Mayor Robert Wagner of New York. And Mayor Wagner told the president that the heroin problem, which had been a serious problem in New York, according to his information from the best sources in the city, was moving further out of control and spreading, getting far more serious. And he urged the president to try to do something about this. President Johnson called in his head of his domestic policy staff, Joseph Califano, and told him what he had learned from the mayor, and said he wanted him to take the necessary measures to address this situation. And Mr. Califano got in touch with David Atchison, who was the Special Assistant, the Secretary of the Treasury for Enforcement, brought to him the instructions of the President, and suggested that Turkey that the Treasury see what it could do, and possibly, if necessary, work with the states, and that Mr. Califano and the President would be fully supportive of what to do what needed to be done. I became the regional, we used to call it the district supervisor of District 17 in 1959 at Rome, Italy. And we had an office at that time in Rome, only in Rome at that time because our Beirut office had been shut down by the political upheaval and fighting and chaos in Lebanon in late '58. But when I got to Rome, as soon as we could, in the late spring of 1959, we reopened the Beirut office. And then subsequently, in 1960, I opened an office in Istanbul, Turkey, and later that year in in Paris, and then in 1961 we opened an office in Marseille. And I used to spend from 1959 until June of 1963, when I left the Rome assignment, I spent about a week in Turkey, sometimes more than that. And I worked a lot in Ankara with the embassy people and with the aid group, USAID. And I began to see, I had a very broad and deep understanding of the enormous economic and military assistance that the United States was giving to Turkey. And I felt that we're helping them in every way except in the drug area, in the narcotic control area, where would be which would at that point in time be most beneficial to the United States. And my concept was that they needed help to try to control the illegal opium production and prevent diversion and suppress the illicit traffic and the illicit manufacture of morphine base for shipment to France. And so I prepared a paper after several years of research, and that recommended that a special program be developed in Turkey, a narcotic control assistance program, to help the Turks implement an opium control program. And in the meanwhile, the 1961 single convention, we talked about several conventions, and in 1961 all of the previous conventions were amalgamated into one single convention, and that is called the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs of 1961. I prepared a paper proposing that Treasury with the State Department develop a narcotic control program for Turkey in the aid infrastructure, which would help them control the crop and prevent illicit manufacture and trafficking, and eventually cut back the crop because it was thought that opium, there were substitutes coming out for example, a cough medicine for codeine, and that there would be less need for opium. So we'd gradually tighten it and reduce it, and eventually probably end the production of gum opium in Turkey. That, at that point in time, didn't get any attention. When Assistant Secretary Atchison received the mandate from Mr. Califano, from the President, he began talking with the Bureau of Narcotics, and at one point they sent me over to talk to him. I had come into the Bureau at the end of 1964, a year before that, to handle the international desk, and so I went over and met with him, and we talked about what could be done, the French connection, and I pointed out that my experience with 2 tours in Europe at that point in time, that even if we were successful in taking out the French connection, the laboratories could move to Italy, they could move to North Africa, they could move to Corsica itself, and it's very difficult to find laboratories. On the other hand, I said, until the Turkish opium could be brought under control, I didn't see any hope of bringing the traffic in heroin under control. And this was explored, and we began talking with the State Department, and my original proposal, called for centralizing the existing production in Turkey, but that was a first step in ending it entirely. And of course, our model on this was Iran. The Shah of Iran ended opium production in Iran in 1955, effective in 1956, and it was a remarkable success in Iran. And Greece ended opium production after 1950. They said, we don't want to bother with opium production. It's too much trouble. We would get into too much trouble, difficulty with this. And Yugoslavia had reduced their opium production to a very tightly knit central area in Macedonia. And even they were moving in the direction to get out of the production in favor of what they call straw production. The Soviets had good control over their opium, and it was no problem. And even they were reducing this production. At that time, there was a declining need for opium raw material, and it was thought that India could supply all of the opium needed in the world for medical purposes, and the Indians were in control of their opium. We were getting no illicit traffic in heroin or opium from India, anywhere in the world. The decision was made that the government of Turkey would be asked to phase out opium with this was it. Now we're now in 1966, and they would issue a decree in July of that year, phase out the production, beginning with the '67 crop. We couldn't get our proposal together in time for that. And in September of '66, the proposal went to the government of Turkey. And I was sent out to Turkey in April of '66 to explain what we were doing technically to the ambassador and his team in Ankara. And then in 1960, well, the ambassador presented it to the government of Turkey, to the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister, indicated he recognized the problem, it was serious, and that Turkey wanted to cooperate in every way it could. But this was a very delicate and technical problem for Turkey, and that he would get back to the ambassador. He couldn't give him any positive response at that time. And then shortly thereafter, he indicated to the ambassador that they had formed a cabinet committee, a study group, and they would get back to him as soon as possible. So by the end of the year, by the end of 1966, there had been no response from Turkey, and I guess the State Department and Treasury and the White House was getting a little bit anxious, and they decided that they would send me out as a technical advisor to the embassy. And I went out for 2 weeks, and I stayed until March. I went out in January, first week of January, and I stayed until March. Well, the Turks had some technical experts in this, and the embassy didn't have a technical expert. And I went out, and I guess I was very helpful to the ambassador, and they wanted me to stay, and we got a movement going. I was housed in the aid office there, the AID office, and the ambassador was dealing with the Prime Minister, and and he was dealing with the Foreign Minister on the subject, and the aid director was dealing with the Foreign Minister. The aid director was dealing with the ministers on the subject. In the various ministries of Turkey where there were aid programs in progress and underway. And the government of Turkey was indicating, yes, they were receptive, and they're working on this, and And then finally, it followed this path until the early part of June, or the end of May, I forget which it was now. It was just about that time, where the Prime Minister said that yes, he thought, well, one thing, he could not end opium production immediately in 1 year, could not end it. It just could not be done, but that they would begin phasing out opium production, and they thought that they would end it within 5 years. So there was no written agreement. This was a verbal agreement between two governments. Now, I must say that Turkey recognized its obligations to the 1967 convention. Article 22 required that any country that could not control its legal opium production had an obligation to end that production. And Turkey took that obligation to heart. We were able to present to the Prime Minister and the higher officials of Turkey hundreds of cases made over the past 15 years, from the early 1950s right up to 1967, we could say 17 years, cases of smuggling of opium and morphine base from Turkey into France, the arrest of Turks in this traffic and so forth. So we documented our case, and that influenced Turkey greatly. Then in March, before this agreement in the late spring, in May, at the end of May or early June of 1967, in March of 67, the President of Turkey visited the United States on a state visit, and Lyndon Johnson personally spoke to him on this subject. Personally spoke to him and requested that Turkey do everything possible to end the production of opium as soon as possible. And the President indicated he was aware of the problem, he was aware of the United States request, and that he assured the President that everything was being done to correct this problem. And so immediately on the 30th of June, the Turkish government took 3 provinces out of production, and then each year thereafter until 1972 they took provinces out. By May of 1968, about a year later, we had negotiated with Turkey a program of assistance, and it only totaled, it was what they call a project loan, and it was a loan to permit the Turks to well, it was 1,800,000 for law enforcement, and 1,200,000 for crop substitution and technical assistance in the agricultural area. I left Turkey in May of '68 and came back to Washington, and then in September I went back to Turkey to implement that program. And then in 1971, Turkey was down, for 1972 they had brought it down to 4 provinces, and Turkey was going to reduce it for the crop year 73 to 2 provinces, and the crop year of 74 for 2 more provinces. The White House under President Nixon, and I have to say again, President Nixon, probably on the basis of his advisors, he had some very good advisors who had served in the Eisenhower administration, people such as Miles Ambrose, and they were aware of what we were doing in Turkey, and they picked it up and carried it forward. It was just like passing the baton in a relay. President Nixon took a personal interest and was knowledgeable on this, and his Secretary of State, William Rogers, who was a former Attorney General, he was knowledgeable. And so it was carried forward, and what the Nixon administration did was they decided that why not have Turkey end all production after with the 72 crop. That would be the last crop. And in response to that, they provided them with about $12 million additional in support to carry this out. It was the end of the morphine base, and by 1971 in the United States, we see 714 kilos of heroin. Skeptics, they were unbelievers, but the point is, 71 was you see, there was opium production. The first year where we were not influenced by Turkish opium production and morphine base was 73. And the seizures went down to what, 133 kilos, I think it was, something like that. From, I think it was 233. And then it was from, but you have to understand that what we had gotten into was a rising, you know, we had almost 400 kilos in 70, 714. That 714 kilos of 1971 was only surpassed by 800 and some odd kilos in 1988. That was the record in the United States. So that was 16 years. Now, the average from 1973 through 1987 is 331 kilos of heroin, at a time when in Western Europe they're seizing, and this heroin is coming from Afghanistan, from Burma, from the raw materials from Thailand, Hong Kong. They're seizing 800 kilos, 900 kilos, 1,000 kilos in some of the European countries like Italy, France, Britain, Germany. And in the Netherlands, little countries like Belgium and Holland are seizing as much heroin as we in the United States. It did explode in the 1970s with cocaine and with marijuana. Well, you see, heroin, we didn't get heroin under control until in 73 we brought it under control. But people sat around here when we knew we had to see something, because people did not want to believe. People did not want to believe that it would work. Believe me, they didn't want to believe it. In 1970, late 73, early 74, a high-ranking French police officer came to the United States in connection with our regular movement of our regular meetings of U.S., French, Canadian Intergovernmental Committee on Narcotic Control, which later was joined by the Italians. See, I wanted to do two things internationally, and my plate was full. I succeeded in addressing the Turkish thing, and then shifting our office from Rome, Italy, where it had been for 17 years, from 1951 until 1969, so we could concentrate our efforts on the French connection with the main thrust of our manpower. And we were very successful in France. And then we built other offices that were supportive. The work done in 1969, 70, 71, 72 in France and Belgium in regard to the French connection was tremendous. We were seizing more heroin and morphine base than was being seized in all of the United States. We had a great operation going. Now all of that receded by 1973. It just collapsed. With our agents, I think sometimes they're disappointed that something like the demise of the Turkish opium was the real key to our success, because they had seized a great quantity of drugs. But we always seized large quantities of drugs. The quantity was getting larger every year because the production was getting larger, and the success came. And the French told me, you know, the French came. And they told me that, you know, together with you people, we did great things in France. Great things in France. But what you did in Turkey, not meaning me personally, the Americans, what you did in Turkey with the morphine base was the answer. They told me. They told me. And you know, you don't find. I think there are some people believe that, like in 1 year, we had such great success over that 2 or 3 year period, that finished the French Connection. They all went to jail. They all didn't go to jail. A lot of them went to jail. Many of them went to jail. But the success was we cut off. It was like turning off a spigot. I used to like to tell people, if Turkey is out of opium, it's like taking Saudi Arabia out of the oil business. It just won't be the same. And it took 17 years. Now, the other thing that you have to that one should understand is that today, why is Western Europe using more heroin than the United States between 1973 and 1996? Why? And the answer is, it's easier to smuggle heroin into Western Europe than the United States. And why does the United States use more cocaine, enormously more, than the Europeans at the moment? Because it's easier to smuggle cocaine into the United States by far than to Western Europe. And that's an argument to support the supply theory. Where drugs are available, people will use them. I don't care what drug it is. You bring it in, you make it available, people will use it. The more you bring available, the more they will use it. The cheaper it is, the more they'll use it. The more you bring, the cheaper it is. So that's what the game is all about. Well, I did a lot of things that I was very proud of. See, I enjoyed it all. I enjoyed it all, but I like to think that I had a lot of success in as an agent, as a field agent, working the street. I loved the street. I loved all of that. I had the opportunity to be a senior agent for a number of years, where I trained younger agents, and I have a whole string of men that I trained became very successful. And then I was cast into a role to develop conspiracy cases, which was, I thought, a sedentary type of thing rather than working on the street in the field, but I accepted it because it was a promotion. And I learned to make conspiracy cases, and it really surprised me how great it was to do, and to bring before the courts and successfully prosecute the major violators, the French Connection types and the mafia who were doing the importing. 2 great conspiracy cases in New York, and then left behind the group that I started, and it carried on for several years thereafter, at least 10 years thereafter, and continued to make the same types of cases, which is a great satisfaction, not only to me personally, but to the organization of which I was a part of. It's like it was a dynasty almost. We put behind bars for long periods of time the major narcotic traffickers in the mafia, and in the Lucchese and in the Genovese and the Bonanno families. And that was a great satisfaction, and had great impact. The work I did undercover overseas, which we really haven't talked much about, was my only chance to work really undercover very much, because in the States, in New York, I quickly became identified. I did a little undercover work, small time undercover work, but then I was a case agent. I was arresting people. I couldn't work undercover. I could be discovered too easily. So I didn't do much of that. I did have a stint undercover in Boston, which was small cases, but it was a great experience. Then I think working in going back as the regional director or the regional supervisor in Europe, it was very interesting, and when I left there in 1963, I had 2 unfinished things. I had wanting to do something in Turkey, and wanting to move the office to Paris, to get at the French connection more directly. And then if you persevere, you can succeed, I guess, because I was able to do both of those. So if I left then, I would have had a great measure of satisfaction. However, I have a greater measure of non-satisfaction because while I spent another several years in service and since I've left, we have never replicated what we did in Turkey and France. Not at all. If the president offered me a job, the only job I would want to do would be to work with the White House and the State Department to negotiate the end of the illicit production of coca, opium, and cannabis in the 16 countries in the world that produce the bulk of those three products. And I am as confident that that can be done as I am that I'm sitting in this chair right now. That can be done. It must be done. There is nothing that the government is doing now that is going to bring our existing problem under control until the production of these crops by a handful of countries is ended. And they have to end it with our help, and that can be done. And other countries, the industrial countries of the world, can help in this. They are willing. I'm sure they can. They will be very willing to join the United States in a coalition of interested nations, that's what I like to call it, to bring about the end of this production. My first heroes are all the men who gave their lives and women who have given their lives in a cause. And a noble cause. This is a noble cause. This is noble work. The international conventions are noble. It's mankind at its most prudent and charitable, beneficent self. I hope it's recognized that they died in an important cause. Yet they are the heroes. I have great respect for anyone who has worked in this work successfly, their courage, their integrity. I have great respect for the men who have integrity is as important as courage. You have to have some courage to do this work, but you also have to have integrity. If you don't have the integrity, the courage is not worth too much. I always go back. You have to selfishly go back to your own leaders. I admired, beginning on the top, Anslinger. He was a great man, a great leader. People, his deputies that I'd worked for, George Cunningham, and of course Mel Harney, who was the assistant commissioner for many years in charge of enforcement, and Garland Williams, my first district supervisor, who was a great leader. My first group leader, who was my mentor, who really taught me a great deal. Partners that I work with, like George O'Connor. When I come in and I look back on all of that, I realized that I was trained by men of courage, integrity, and compassion. They were tough men, but they had compassion in their heart for the drug addict, the drug user, understanding for them, and even traffickers. They treated them fairly and professionally, although they despised them, as we all despised them. It was an informal indoctrination, but you certainly develop a very strong distaste for the people who trafficked in drugs. And I admired a lot of prosecutors I work with. I admired judges that I sat before. In 1951, I was programmed to go over to develop a lead that I had uncovered in New York through an informant of an organization that was bringing heroin in from France. And but they were operating out of base in Antwerp, and I was programmed to go overseas to do that. And then, while a day or two before I was to go, the case I discussed that Arthur Giuliani was developing, the Orsini case, it so happened that a letter was received by the wife of this important mafia guy from the Lucchese family, one of the principals in this case, Shilatani. His wife received a letter and turned over the letter to the government, and the letter invited someone to come over to talk, and I was then designated to go over and talk to these people who were supplying the drugs, the heroin, and my photograph was sent to them, and I had $50. They were sent a torn dollar bill for identification. And I went to Paris in November of 1951 and checked into a hotel, and Cusack came up from Rome. I went to the place to contact the man, and I couldn't contact him, but I left a message where I was, and the next day he contacted me at the hotel, and he then took me by car to meet with a man who turned out to be Marius Ansaldi, and he was at that time known as a big racketeer in Paris. He was not known as a drug trafficker. He was a man probably 50, 55 years of age. But he had been big in black market, and he had been big in the gold traffic during the war. He was a racketeer type. However, he was well acquainted with all the major traffickers. So it turned out that there was another man who was probably his partner named Dominique Ressant, and Dominique Ressant's wife was kind of used as a messenger carrier back and forth across the Atlantic also. She had been a French movie actress. We didn't know how important this meeting was. The difficulty was that Ansaldi complained to me, as he complained to the letter, that he was had not been paid for certain deliveries, and that he wanted to know when he could expect to be paid, and he wanted to assure them that he had new merchandise ready to be moved. And he outlined in the letter how much he had and when he'd have it available for movement. Unfortunately, it was a period of time where the State Department wouldn't give us a passport with another identity on it, and the French police picked up through their telephone interceptions the fact that these people had determined that I was not who I said I was, that I was a narcotic agent. So really what they did, they just went underground. They just didn't surface again. We set up another meeting, and but they never kept it. They never called. So this proved to be a very valuable meeting, because they then had this Ansaldi identified, and their surveillance on him uncovered a laboratory. He had a big laboratory, one of the biggest laboratories ever taken in France, in a suburb of Paris. And that laboratory was seized in June of 1992. And it was one of the most successful cases, and they had been supplying heroin to both the Lucchese and Genovese family in New York. That case I was able to develop into a conspiracy when I came back to New York in 1953. I developed another interesting case because when I went to Europe, we were operating, our permanent operation was only 2 months old or 3 months old when I got there. And so we really had a lot to learn and a lot to discover. But my Antwerp leads proved valuable in that that case that I went there originally to develop was not successfully developed for 10 years. I mean, it took that long to get that group. But because we just didn't have a good entree. But when I was fooling around up there, meeting people, I ran into people who were on the fringes of the traffic. And finally, we got an introduction to a Greek who came up from Paris, and he had heroin connections in Paris. We brought another agent that had just come over, Tony Zerilli, and introduced him to this character. And he was brought down to Paris and cut into one violator, and then he was hanging out in a cafe where other violators were, and they became interested in him. So as a result of that, Zerilli was able to make three other cases down there in Paris, very important undercover cases. But the major case I made was against another major trafficker's brother. We didn't know that. It involved the Andriani and Augustino group. That was a type case that I used to use other agents and informants in doing. It was a technique I used. When a man would go to jail, and we knew who his source of supply was, as soon as he got to jail, and he'd be placed in isolation, he couldn't reach anybody, I would send an informant or an undercover agent directly to his connection, saying that he was sent by the guy that just went to jail. And that he said he could take care of him, and he'd buy an ounce of heroin or whatever the guy was selling. So what happened was a French seaman was caught. His name was Alain Leroy on the Liberté or the Flandre, I forget, a French ship in New York Harbor. He had a couple kilos of heroin. And the French police figured out that he was sent, or he was working for a man by the name of Jean Corre, who operated from a bar in Le Havre. So I went down, and before going to see Corre, we knew who his girlfriend was. So I visited his girlfriend, that is the seaman's girlfriend, and Leroy's girlfriend, and talked to her and told him, you know, I just seen him in prison and he was fine, and he'll be there a few years, etc., etc. And I had a visit with her, and then I went up to see Corre because I wanted to be able to tell him that I did a favor to his friend and so forth. We were not sure that Alain, that he was linked with Corre, but it was very humorous. Really, it was almost just like a movie. I got to Le Havre about 11 o'clock in the morning, and I found this bar was right across the street from the station. It was a huge French bar. It must have been 30 feet long. And Corre was just like a New York mafia guy. He was sitting in the corner of the bar with it looking out the window. So as I come up to the window was clear. I look in, I said, gee, I had seen pictures of Corre. It looks like Corre. So I walked in, I didn't look at him, and I sat down. I walked right up to the bar. I didn't sit down. I walked up to the bar where the bartender was sitting. He was in the middle of the bar. So I said to him, I'm looking for Jean Corre. And he says, are you a friend of Jean Corre's? And loud enough for Corre to hear. I said, no, I'm a friend of a friend. Oh, you're a friend of a friend. Meanwhile, as I'm saying this, I could see Corre, corner of my eye, coming up along the bar. And he looks at me and he says, Jean Corre, c'est moi. So I told him about Alan, to make a long story short, he then showed up 2 days later, pursuant to my arrangements, at my hotel in Paris, and he and his partner delivered a kilo of cocaine to me as a sample, and that was the evidence. And they took me all over Paris, and we had planned to arrest them, with the delivery. And however, it turned out that the one guy identified his brother as Michel Cisco. His name was Antoine D'Agostino, I guess, and a major trafficker. He was in Mexico at the time, well known to us from Montreal, New York, and so forth. But the French police couldn't possibly keep up the surveillance, so I ended up getting the delivery. And I had, I think they were going to deliver a full kilo to me. But when we got down to it, when we got to the place, so I talked them into letting me, give me the quarter, and I'll be back in 2 weeks when I come back from the States after delivering this, and I'll pick up a kilo from you. So they went for that. But then, when I came back, so to speak, they wanted to the money out front, and I couldn't give them the money, so they were arrested, and they both went to jail.